Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the YouTube show and podcast, None of Our Businesses. This week, we got something special. We'll call it the Cannabis Edition. You may know that our team occasionally works in cannabis, but this week we have an expert who works a lot in cannabis and has been doing it for many years, Katye Maxson Landis. She's a CPA, the founder of Moxy Accounting in Portland, Oregon. Moxy Accounting provides educational services, business advisory services, entity formation consulting, and just straight up quality accounting. They're a champion of fiscal literacy and best practices for the cannabis industry. Katye has been practicing as a CPA for 9 years in this industry, bringing over 20 years of total experience. She is a contributing member of the AICPA's Cannabis Advisory Board. She's spoken at workshops across the country and hosts a one-of-a-kind comprehensive 7-week course for cannabis accountants. She's always an interesting guest on any podcast. She's prolific in the art of using colorful colloquialisms and comes to any topic with a healthy dose of curiosity. I know you're going to love Katye as I do, as I have working with and talking to her over many years. So we welcome Katye to our show today. And with me, as always, aside from Katye, we have Charlie Zygmunt.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
And Jack DiMatteo.
Welcome.
All right, well, here are some of the topics we're going to be talking about today. We've got 3 articles. We said this is our cannabis edition, so we're going to be talking about more cannabis security suits hit dockets. From the Rolling Stone, New York about to legalize recreational weed. Of course, they're counting up the tax revenues. And breaking news, kind of as an addendum to that, Katie's going to tell us about the fact that as we're recording this, it was just recently Virginia has legalized recreational marijuana. And finally, we're going to be talking about an academic article from the Journal of Cannabis, Accounting and the U.S. Cannabis Industry, Federal Financial Regulations and the Perspectives of Certified Public Accountants and Cannabis Business Owners. All right, well, with that, I'm gonna start us off with the first article. We are going to be talking about cannabis security suits hitting dockets. So the problems that are being talked about in this article, they seem to revolve mostly around incorrect or misleading disclosures. And the article kind of starts out pointing out that actually there's a certain flavor of incorrect or misleading disclosures that are common to most industries. So it's not just in the cannabis industry where this happens. And the lawyers who were writing in this article even stated that it is, in their opinion, it's a bad part of the U.S. jurisprudence that these kind of lawsuits are allowed all the time, where as soon as somebody announces a merger acquisition, you get these lawsuits, these derivative lawsuits of people saying that there was some misleading statement in the merger documents. So the article was getting at that these kind of lawsuits are going to be are going to probably be of particular nuisance and problem in the cannabis industry, but they were saying, that variety is common to all industries, and of course the cannabis industry is suffering from that variety. But then they go on to say, it's beyond that. The cannabis industry has a particular problem with disclosures and misleading statements that go beyond kind of the normal kind of everyday lawsuits that you'll see. And I thought I had wrote down the exact language that they used, but they took out one example and they said, well, one of the examples that kind of highlights this kind of core issue is that they were talking about how the cannabis company made various alleged material misstatements and omissions in press releases and public filings. And I think that's very illustrative of the kind of the issues that these suits seem to revolve around. So I've got kind of my particular take on this, and then I'll kind of throw it out to the rest of our panel here. But I kind of asked the question, is this going to be of particular problem in the cannabis industry? Is there something about the cannabis industry that uniquely makes it ripe for these kind of lawsuits? And my take on this, and I'd love to hear everyone else kind of their thought independent of my thought or their thought on my thought, either way. but my take on this is that in working with some of the cannabis entrepreneurs that I've worked with, they've really, at this point, particularly in the recreational cannabis market where it's legal for state purposes but not for federal purposes, they've gotten pretty adept at how they kind of maneuver around government agencies and regulations and finding the blind spots that they can kind of play in, so to speak, right? And I think that now that they've done that, I think one of the advantages that they've had in doing that over the last few years is that most governments have been starved for resources. And so I think a lot of these entrepreneurs and organizations kind of have patted themselves on the back of, well, we know how to deal with this kind of thing. We know how to deal with regulation. We know how to stay under the radar, if that's kind of their way of doing it. We know how to do that because they've been successful with it. Because if you take like tax regulation, for example, in the IRS, I would propose the IRS really hasn't had enough resources to go to town on this kind of issue. And so I think these entrepreneurs to some extent have been misled as to how safe they are from this kind of thing. And so then when you get into the kind of securities environment where the counterparty isn't always the government, but it's the general public, well, now you've got a different kind of deal, because now the opposing party that you're potentially guarding against or fighting against or mitigating your risks against is not an under-resourced government agency anymore. It is the general public, which may have, in some cases, unlimited resources to throw crap at you. So it would be interesting to see if that really does change the dynamic for a lot of these cannabis companies that are kind of dabbling in the securities area beyond areas that are just regulated by government. So with that, I'll throw it open to the floor and see what everyone else has to say.
I would agree. I came from a firm that was an audit firm, so I did 7 years in audit, which I think is unusual for a lot of CPAs these days. I think really there's a divide in public accounting that tax does not audit, audit does not tax, and I think that's a detriment in a lot of ways to well-rounded CPAs. and what struck me interestingly about this article, because it is not that lawsuits are happening, because in the 9 years that I've been dealing with cannabis, lawsuits are the norm, or at least the threat of that, because there is so much bad acting. And this is, and what this says to me is that the legal environment, the regulatory environment, the compliance environment, the governmental environment is wholly unprepared for the reality of the cannabis environment, because it is not an emerging industry, in my opinion. It is a industry that is just legitimizing. It is a fully functioning and has been operational industry for 70 years, 60, 80. It has its own handshake deals and understandings, and there are, in the realm of accounting, we have made some assumptions, and in law and in business, I think we have made some assumptions that the cannabis industry has no interest in following and has not built itself to behave well. And as if anything, in the last administration, however we feel about it, it showed that when an actor decides not to follow the unwritten rules of what our government and behavior and expected business behavior is supposed to be, it creates a lot of havoc. And so what was interesting to me about this is that here is a legislative system or a judicial system or an auditing system or a regulatory system that doesn't know where cannabis came from and what they have, and when they say one thing, what they mean. And so that is a buyer beware in more ways than just industry. stocks, penny stocks, or Canadian stock, or merger and acquisition. That is, it's so important, and I may harp on this often. I will apologize, perhaps, but not right now. It is so important for the government to figure out what it wants to do with cannabis, because the calico compliance and regulatory environment is going to do nothing but waste many people's times and dollars with an industry that can't be had a leash put on it yet. And so, Tilray is an interesting problem. MedMen is an interesting problem. Helix is an interesting problem. These are giant businesses operating inside of the United States that should be doing business regular, but are really having to deal with business as cannabis has defined the rules right now. And yet cannabis often doesn't tell people what the rules are at the end of the day. And so the legal system is going to have a heavy lift if we are left to work it all out through a court case instead of through common sense or pragmatic approaches to standardizing how the United States will handle cannabis unilaterally.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And just want to kind of add on that. I think one of the other things I've seen happen is that in the cannabis industry, entrepreneurs will get ideas about how things work, and they'll have kind of their beliefs about how taxes work for their business and how things are supposed to be. And they'll then share those ideas with their other entrepreneurs. And it becomes this sort of like, team understanding of what we think is supposed to happen. And that may or may not be what is actually correct. And they don't know until they finally get through years of filing and doing things the wrong way, and then something comes back to bite them. And so I think kind of the spread of misinformation in that industry in particular is a problem that is prevalent quite a bit.
Yeah, I call that the urban myths that I have to counteract constantly. I have to have my finger on the urban, what's this year's flavor of urban myth that's not, that's like TikTok tax but worse, tax effect.
We used to call it bro science or bro logic, right?
Well, I have other not nicer names I could call it, but I'm going to keep the delicate ears out of that. You're not, ain't nobody got time for that.
It's we live in this litigious society to begin with. And so you take an industry like cannabis, where maybe the reputation precedes it right or wrong. I mean, it's like the perfect storm for lawsuits. Cannabis companies work with, there seems to be a hefty budget for legal, because like you say, if you're not in court, there's a threat of being dragged into court. It's a new industry. It's fumbling its way through, and everybody's just sitting back waiting for things to go wrong. As you can see, it just keeps adding a state at a time, and it's still in a stage of growing in acceptance nationwide. And when it comes to these types of industries, all the vice industries, they get beat up by the tax code, local taxation. Cannabis is no different. It just they take it out on them, but in this society, I mean, it's the perfect storm for lawsuits and litigation, and you're going to see a lot of them come into the courtroom, and then they're going to start building some precedents as they apply to this industry. And hopefully at that point, as this industry starts to mature, it'll die down. It'll just be like any other industry. It'll have its precedents in place. You'll know what the limits are, what the boundaries are, and you won't quite see everything going to court like it does now.
But I do think it brings up a good point that in audit, disclosure is insufficient. I think that audit expectations, rules, that the job of the auditor has transformed even since I got out of school in 2005. I mean, I think that the weight that is placed upon auditors to provide assurance and to be able to catch all sorts of issues that are outside of the capacity of a audit team to disclose or find is unrealistic for our industry that is already so pressured and stressed. And when you add cannabis, which is unarguably the most complex area of accounting I've ever been in, which is, I've not done international. I don't do multi-state operators. I don't do $50 million businesses and all that sort of stuff. But really, we're accountants, and accounting is kind of Build-A-Bear. Like, you've got 2 arms and a body and 2 legs and 2 eyes and a nose and a mouth. And cannabis says, no, actually, this arm is attached where the ear is, and there's really no foot. And, and so auditing it when it won't play by the rules of what a bear is supposed to be, I think is unrealistic for the market to expect of us, and to expect of an industry that the government won't create swim lanes for. And so, again, buyer beware. If you want to invest in a Tilray, in a acreage, in in whatever, I think it's unrealistic that you should expect the court to protect your interest, or an auditor. Because this is still very, very much the Wild West.
Yeah, we're going to hit on this in a later article, but I think that's a great point for us to remember in terms of talking about auditing. Because I'll say here, and then we can maybe talk more about in our later article about are these things really even auditable? And
I have opinions on that. Let me tell you.
Yeah. So, but before we get there, Charlie's got an article. Charlie, take it away.
Yeah, so just to kind of highlight the issue, I've found an article in Rolling Stone entitled "New York May Finally Be Legalizing Weed." Now, this has been out for a little bit, and that has since been, this agreement has been put into place, and so it is officially legalized. But I wanted to talk about it just in more of a general sense of all of these different states are now turning towards legalization. They're the 15th state to do it. They're putting in some interesting characteristics into the agreement that I thought were admirable, and I wanted to kind of highlight. One of the things that they're doing, they estimate that that legalizing it will bring in $350 million of revenue annually for New York, and they're going to have a plan, of course, on how to spend that money. A lot of the money is dedicated to go towards basically decriminalizing and helping to overturn previous convictions for things that have now been made legal. And so I wanted to kind of just talk about basically the idea of that, the justice system kind of acknowledging fault a little bit and saying that, hey, we may have convicted you on something before, but we're changing course now on what is and isn't legal. And we're going to retroactively take offenses that had been, levied against someone and then kind of make them no longer an issue and have them expunged from records. And so I want to talk about it from that angle and also get your take on how long do you guys think before every state comes around on this issue and it just becomes legalized all over the United States? Because we're now 15 states deep. And I think as they start to see more and more that it's working, then that will become, that much more of an impetus for other states to get on board. So what do you guys think about that?
Well, it's weird. I mean, it reminds me of, I remember, 30 years ago, there's 2 places in the country you could legally place a wager, Las Vegas and Atlantic City. Mm-hmm. And slowly they started with the Indian casinos. And then slowly the racetrack started adding slot machines. And I know about it in Ohio because, they were the last one to go down with the ship. They weren't going, by golly, they weren't going to have slots here. And every state around us with their racing got slot machines and stables were leaving. And finally, when it was on life support, they caved and they did it. And now you see slot, you could probably pick up a rock from where you're sitting now and probably hit a casino or a slot machine. And it's pretty much everywhere. So I definitely have an opinion on this, Charlie. I think it's only a matter of time before it hits all 50 states. And whether it's at the federal level, local level, nobody even pays lip service to controlling spending in any way, shape, or form. So the money's going to have to come from somewhere. So, I think I don't think it's going to stop at the cannabis industry. Pick a vice, any vice. I think there's going to be more to follow because they're starting to realize that it's going on anyways. They might as well bring it, into the light of day, tax it, make money on it. So, I think I just think this snowball's just going to keep picking up momentum, and it's going to be the same things with the gambling. You'll have those states that hold out to go down with the ship, and they'll be behind the 8 ball because these ones that were early adapters, they'll have a certain competitive advantage because they'll have the systems in place and they'll already have a customer base, and I think the ones that are going to be late to the game are probably going to pay a price that they may never get may never get up to speed like the other ones do.
Yeah, I am unbelievably interested in how the East Coast is going to enact adult use cannabis legislation, because it is so very different than the West Coast's position. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. There's only 3 states on the West Coast, as opposed to the East Coast, stacked on top of each other, as goes New York, goes New Jersey. New Jersey went first. As goes New Jersey, goes Virginia. Virginia went 2 days ago. First state in the South. However, Virginia is talking about not making adult use be actually coming into play until 2024. Why? So that they can litigate it to death and make sure it maybe doesn't happen, which is really what they've already, many of the opposing sides of the argument have expressed their intent to do. And yet it often comes down to and boils down to this idea of tax revenue, tax dollars, money, tax. California spoke a lot about tax. Colorado spoke a lot about tax. Oregon has spoken a lot about tax. Undeniably, all of these states have received a lot of tax dollars, but boy, they haven't put a dent in the illicit market for the most part. Especially not California, that expected to see 3 times their tax revenue and was shocked that they couldn't get the way that they rolled out adult use didn't immediately shut down the illicit market. I think New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Virginia, DC, already legal, by the way, but you can't sell it, you can't buy it, are all going to have a very interesting problem if all they do is say tax revenue without bringing in, as Charlie put it, social justice, the actual aspects of why the tax revenue won't follow unless the government actually makes real sensible policy change at a number of different levels. I absolutely believe, and I think Oregon has shown, that people want a legal access to a market that's well tested, that has controls. They're willing to pay more. I'm starting to have conversations with both businesses and with CPAs and enrolled agents and tax preparers all over the country that I educate about this race to the bottom and how the consumer needs to take more responsibility, that they're not going to have $10 weed anymore. Because if you put that kind of a pressure on a business to produce something at an impossible tax-free price, the state will never receive its tax dollars. There will never be the ability to show that this industry has a legitimacy or a potential for a legitimacy that social justice can support, that decriminalizing should in fact empower. There is no way, if we don't all come together and say, okay, let's call a spade. Weed's been around forever. When I spoke in 2019 at the New York State Society's cannabis conference, they were super excited about the potential $20 billion industry, and yet not one of those people will work with a non-legal cannabis business in the state of New York. Not one of them will provide solutions to an existing medical dispensary or business, because these are all big, giant firms. They're waiting. But if you don't actually put your toe in, and I think help people understand that there is a relationship between the tax revenue and the policy, and if tax revenue and policy is completely divorced from this idea that people who are sitting in jail over drug crimes that cost a lot of money maybe should be released, maybe there is a mea culpa that needs to happen. And I think that's really what much of the government is afraid of, is this reckoning. We've seen it in social justice movements everywhere, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, etc. This reckoning concept. I think that, we have to be able to, as accounting professionals and as business people, be able to speak to this idea that this is an industry that's going to make money, it's going to make tax, if we can help it control its own bad behavior, its own historical need to be in the shadows and not tell the truth and not behave like a business and get out of tax, use this urban myth of what's the next thing we do to get around 280E. If we as professionals in the room can't speak to the legislative people and help provide a way to weave together successful tax, which is what we as accountants have done. We have been the finger to implement successful taxation in this country for, I don't know, however long, because the government fucks it up constantly and has all year, by the way. Let's change another policy next week. But if we have the ability as professionals to be able to have a sensible conversation about how taxation can be, how states can benefit from decriminalizing in sensible and reasonable ways that meet their population's understanding. New York doesn't need to talk to Oregon. New York doesn't have Oregon's understanding of cannabis. New York has New York's understanding of cannabis. New Jersey has New Jersey's understanding, and they have to talk about what makes sense from a state and local taxation piece, but they also have to provide opportunities for the illicit market to translate. There has to be something like what was the name of Bush's 2010 offshore money back into the United States? Like, they need to have a way to be able to come into the light of day without. Yes. They need to be able to have that, and the exchange for that coming into the light of day might be that the state doesn't have to mea culpa, or the federal government doesn't have to mea culpa about the fact that the drug policy has been discriminatory in the past. Can we have truth and reconciliation now? We're going to let you come into the light of day, and you're going to let us release people whose lives have been so adversely impacted by a plant that people are angry. And let's just try to tax it. Let's be reasonable about this and tax it going forward. New York is fascinating. The East Coast is a fascinating study, because we're at 15 adult use states. We're at 34 states. 70% of the population of the country is okay with this, but the government can't figure out a way to back out of the room from their failed drug policy. So
I think the way you framed this topic was great in terms of we're about to see how the East Coast handles this. I think that's right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes down as well.
Yeah.
I have one more article here, and I'm really excited to get particularly Katie's take on this, because she has been living this issue for many years as we've been talking to each other. She's been living the exact topic of this article. And so this comes from the Journal of Cannabis Research. It's an academic article, and it's the title of it is Accounting and the U.S. Cannabis Industry, Federal Financial Regulations and the Perspectives of Certified Public Accountants and Cannabis Business Owners. And so there were three kind of questions that they were researching in this article. One of the first question was, why are some certified public accountants, CPAs is what many of you hear us called, but why are some CPAs unwilling to provide services to cannabis-related entities? Great question. How do cannabis-related businesses compensate for the lack of CPA services? That's an interesting question as well. And then the last one, what does a CPA need to know about the cannabis industry prior to engaging to provide services to cannabis-related businesses? And so, I think these are all great things. And Katie and the rest of our panel is kind of taking a look at the article. So I don't want to pigeonhole anyone's discussion of it too much, but I am particularly interested in like that third question, and maybe I'll restate it in a slightly different way for Katie. I'd be particularly interested in hearing Katie's thoughts on this, on what are the key cannabis industry specific issues that the average CPA just may not be aware of or have expertise in. You know, you mentioned this and when we were discussing a prior article that a lot of accounting is like build a bear and cannabis isn't. And so maybe this would be a great chance to elaborate on that point. And that goes to the third question they asked in this article about what would CPAs need to know prior to engaging in the industry? So what is it? What are the key issues that your average CPA probably doesn't know?
Well, can I just put a pin in that for just a minute? Because Jack, you're a CPA, right? What's your answer to, do you work with the cannabis industry?
Yes, I do actually.
Okay, why do you?
It's a legitimate business. It's a legal business. I mean, it's funny. This actually, you know, I had a question from this cannabis. They were asking about valuation. So I'm thinking, wow, it's a new industry. Something in a new industry. I actually went out and I looked it up on YouTube thinking I wasn't going to find anything on it. I was actually inundated with the amount of information. Actually a firm who advertises they're in the top 20 in the country, and they were like an early adapter to the cannabis industry because they were going to be underserved. The name escapes me, and I wouldn't give them a shameless plug anyways, but I like I say, that was kind of their approach, that they saw that this was an underserved market, and a lot of the very, very big firms were staying away from it, and they saw it as an opportunity to step in and be the early adapter and be the one that embraces it, and they can see where the end game is, which I think they're looking at the bigger picture.
Because the number one reason that they say that cannabis people aren't, 61% of the CPAs polled said it's because it's federally illegal, which I think speaks again to our fiscal conservancy, our as a population, our group, we are rule followers, we are bright line lovers, we are box filler inners. Which is exactly why I'm choosing to educate in the industry, because I feel like we have fallen very far from off the pedestal of what we as certified public accounting professionals can be. So I think that the first thing that you should really know about the cannabis industry, it comes with looking at how question number 2 was answered. How do cannabis business owners compensate for the lack of certified public accounting services? Well, I think it's hilarious that these poor people got duped in this article when I read it, where they themselves said 8 out of the 13 CPA firms that they spoke with at length said, no way are we serving this industry. So that's 62%, right? But 10 out of 10 of the cannabis businesses said that they have a CPA that does their taxes for them, because 9.5 out of 10 of the cannabis people that I've worked with for the last 9 years think that anyone that does taxes is a certified public accountant. So we have done a terrible job from a certified public accounting standpoint, or a great job, depending upon how you want to look at it, of hiding back in the shadows and making sure that we're not an option, that these guys are available to take advantage of. I think the first thing that a certified public accountant who's getting involved in this industry needs to realize is that their clients don't know what they are. Their clients, that cannabis business and cannabis business owners have a different risk tolerance than the accounting professional. And it is the job of the accounting professional not to believe the client. I am one of the only CPAs that I know. I'm actually one of the only accountants that I know that has a set set onboarding process for my clients that starts with a non-negotiable paid 2-hour initial consultation. So depending upon the client and what's happening, that initial consultation is $500, because you're going to spend 2 hours of my time.
I want to say something real quick related to what you're saying right now. that was in the article, because there was something in the article that made me laugh, and I wanted to relate it to exactly what you're talking about right now. So there was a question that they asked some of the CPAs that do work with cannabis companies. How do you go about client acceptance? What are your client acceptance procedures? And the answer that they quoted was, oh, we just try to get to know the client like any other potential client.
No.
And yeah, I was just laugh out loud. I said, well, I'm sure Katie's going to have something to say about that. So yeah, continue, because I know you and I have talked over the years, and you've got a very detailed and client onboarding is such an important part of your process. So yeah, carry on.
Yeah. And you know what, and you know why it is because here's the story. So so my initial consultation is 2 hours long. It is a set prescribed series of things. It starts with about a half an hour before the client even walks into the room of looking at them on Google, the Secretary of State, going to social media venues, create like an auditor, creating an expectation of what I think should be walking into my office, because I need to be able to put that up against what really does walk into my office from a facts and circumstances standpoint. I don't care who physically walks into my office. I mean, whatever. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a 27 to 41-year-old white male in a black hoodie. So that is what is going to walk into my office. I've got that. But the reality is that it starts at the beginning, and it moves all the way through a process of being able to investigate how financially literate they are, whether or not they're going to lie to me, where their origin story comes from, what in their origin story might go against what I just researched about them. Because if you come in with your LLC that your lawyer produced for you that has a 2019 Articles of Org date, and you've been rocketing since 2014 on social media, then we've got to have a conversation about the difference between those two things. These are absolutely not nail salons. They are not restaurants. They are not law firms. They are not businesses that have been asked to participate in the economy in the same way that those businesses have. They have been denied banking. They have been denied clear, bright lines in legislation. I don't know if anybody else in the room has read the Oregon medical marijuana law, the OMMP rules, but it's some of the worst, most misguided legislation from the standpoint of the lay person trying to understand how to implement, what their card does and how it protects them, and how it still means you've gotta file a tax return. But if no one will help you with that, how could you possibly file a tax return in this environment? So what does a certified public accountant need to know? They need to know that these clients are risk-seeking and they're very comfortable not filing a tax return. And you are not a trusted advisor to them. That is their lawyer. That space is filled. You, me, Ty, Jack, Charlie, we're actually the fingers of the government and we're the enemy. And so if you don't create and establish boundaries, rapport, and have the ability to check your client's story, they are comfortable telling the same story over and over. The urban myth that Charlie was talking about tax stuff, that urban myth population of what you can tell a professional about what you do or that they're going to believe you, is one of the things that most deeply predicates the, at least the medical to adult use conversion clients that I've worked with. Because again, those people are scared of the government. They have not been given a free amnesty, an immunity to be able to be prosecuted if they do the right thing and come into the taxed environment. They're looking to us to help them navigate very scary waters. So, in my mind, it is the social relationship, it is building the rapport that is one of the first things that you have to be able to do, because they have been asked to lie about what they're doing this whole time, except to their lawyers, who they trust. So, The second thing I would say that's most, so build the rapport and actually approach the client very much like something you've never seen before, because I guarantee you've never seen them before. And the second thing I would say is that Circular 230 does not protect you. Circular 230 is not what you can rely on as a tax preparer to take a client's information in the cannabis space and not get a preparer penalty, in my opinion. If you refuse to look at transactions, if you refuse to get back to bookkeeping, if you don't understand what your client's doing, if you won't go to their farm, if you won't walk their dispensary, if you won't check to see what they have in their books and records is what they're actually doing, I don't think you've met your professional obligation and standard that says that you've done due diligence and know what's happening. And I really feel like if you're afraid of your clients, you shouldn't be involved in cannabis. They're not horrible, evil, drug dealing people. They're just folk that would like the opportunity, Gesundheit, Jack, the opportunity to be able to participate in this economy the way that everybody else does. And the way everybody else gets to participate in the economy is by having a CPA. So I got involved in this back in 2011 because I wanted to get out of public accounting. I'm going to be the first person to say that. I was like, I'm just going to go be a bookkeeper for cannabis people because I can probably make a whole lot of money doing that and I don't have to do tax returns. By the time I did good books and records, A, there was no one to hand them off to because no one would file a tax return for them. And B, if I've done all that work and I've put all that emotional time and energy into understanding what's going on, I'm going to file that tax return. I'm the beneficiary of that work. And I become a trusted advisor because I'm going to help them. But really, I wanted them to pay for the street lights and the school and the roads like I do, because I file a tax return every year and I want them to pay their employees because Social Security, and it's very much like I pay taxes, you should pay taxes. And they're like, I can't pay taxes, no one will help me. Oh, well, I can fix that. And I feel like other people can too, if they're willing to look at the client in a way that meets them where they are, not where people think they're supposed to be. But I have lots of feelings about this article because I teach this article. I mean, I am trying to entice qualified professionals to become involved in this industry because after 9 years, really the majority or much of the work that I start with is unwinding the bad tax position or the fraudulent return that the licensed tax preparer or the enrolled agent that did not understand what they were doing for this cannabis business threw together in the interest of meeting the client's expectation of not paying a lot in taxes. The cannabis industry already knows it's going to pay a lot in taxes. You don't have to meet that burden anymore. You have to be of good moral character and enough of a professional to be able to mitigate where you can and not deceive at all costs.
Before we close up talking about this topic, you mentioned that you're helping other accountants or doing some training on this. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What is it? What is the program that you have for other accountants? Yeah.
I have, after 9 years, I have decided to create what's called the Moxy Accountant. It is a cohort program that is 7 sessions, 2 hours a pop in a row. It is a 7-week course that takes you from, so you're interested in the cannabis industry and have or want to have a tax and or advisory service practice in it, through the stages that I went through to be able to feel like I can set up my practice and my onboarding in such a way that I protect my firm and my license first off. And then I onboard the client with as much information as possible accurately to be able to then explain to both them and myself how documentation, bookkeeping, and record keeping needs to happen in order to be able to substantiate both the books and eventually a tax return, and unfortunately, eventually an audit, to be able to use that documentation and that transactional information to actually craft a client-specific cost of goods sold position, understanding the different areas that cost of goods sold under Code Section 471 really requires of the practitioner to understand. And then now Code Section 471C, which came in under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and has been the new urban myth darling of accounting, tax, CPA, cost of goods sold accounting now, and then how you are understanding and applying 280E to a defensible tax position, and then finally slamming 1987 tax law into a 2020 tax software because it doesn't want to do that. It doesn't want to do, we as accountants, again, we are box filler outers, we are bright line lovers. We don't like to override our tax software. And when we do, we really need to be able to defend it because you can go sideways really quickly. And yet there are very complicated issues surrounding basis and ownership and values and defensibility, and where you've strayed into being too aggressive versus not aggressive enough, that are part of this teaching process and this 7-week class, which is NASBA certified, so it's also the gimme of CPE, but really is to try to build a place called the Moxy Accountant that is a virtual water cooler. So that, I mean, I remember one of the first reasons that I called UTI is because I, back in 2016, got into an accounting situation where I was just paralyzed. I just didn't know how a regular business would have dealt with the issue at hand, let alone a cannabis business. And I needed to have someone who had been in accounting longer than me to give me a roadmap, because I was a young CPA at that point. And I feel like in order to entice people into working in cannabis, you have to give them a place to bring their questions where they're not going to be judged and there's not going to be some sort of, problem. They don't have to disclose clients or that, but we have to be able to speak contemporaneously with our peers in order to be able to get answers and decide for us where our line is, because tax is done on such a gray scale in regular business that gray scale still exists with cannabis, but the cliff is much more severe in my mind. And so the very first thing we want to do as professionals, because we all took those tests and we never want to take them again. The first thing we're trying to do is be of good moral character and keep our license and do right by our clients. At least we hope the majority, right? So that is the group that this cohort is a 7 weeks of being able to build an interactive conversation with the same group of 15 people, so that you have the ability. I don't want to do an Ohio tax return. I would like to refer that to Jack. I don't want to do a Nebraska tax return. I would like to refer that to Tanya. I want to do Oregon work. I'm an Oregon tax preparer. And I feel like the ability to be able to be supportive of each other's work in the states where we reside, because cannabis is coming in this regulatory patchwork that no one can stay on top of, really requires that we become experts in the arena that we're already good in at the state level.
Well, I think, that's fantastic what you're building there. And we're going to put links to where people can find out more about this in the comment section or in the descriptions of the media here that we're posting. Katie, thanks for joining us. I think this has been a great round. It's often Jack and Charlie and I are often just talking to each other about articles. So this special cannabis edition, having an expert come in and join us and talk through these issues with us has been fantastic.
I appreciate the opportunity. I'm glad you let me sidetrack you into a non-regular business articles for a week.
Thank you for watching this week's special edition of the None of Our Businesses podcast and YouTube show. Special thanks to our guest, Katye. We hope you learned something you didn't already know about the ever-evolving cannabis industry. Hit that like button, give us a max rating, tell your friends about our show. We'll see you right back here next week. Have a great week, everybody.